Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into something that'll make you question everything you think you know about survival. We're going back, way back, not just to your grandparents' time, not even to recorded history, but to a world so brutal, so unforgiving, that the simple act of keeping a baby alive was nothing short of miraculous. I'm talking about life 1 million years ago, when our earliest ancestors faced challenges that would break even the toughest modern survivor. If you're enjoying this journey through time, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know. And I'm always curious about where you're all watching from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our community connect through these incredible stories of human endurance. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step into a world where every sunrise was a victory against impossible odds. Picture this. You've just been transported back 1 million years. The good news, you're alive and breathing. The bad news, you're about to discover why less than half of all children born in this era would see their 5th birthday. Welcome, where par, to the Pleistocene. Epochenting wasn't about choosing the right school or worrying about screen time. It was about one thing, keeping your offspring alive through another day in a world that was actively trying to kill them. The landscape around you is both beautiful and terrifying. Vast savannas stretch to the horizon, punctuated by dense woodlands and rocky outcrops. But this isn't some peaceful nature documentary. This is a battlefield where every rustle in the grass could mean death, every shadow could hide a predator, and every moment of inattention could cost your family everything. Our ancestors, Homo erectus, were remarkable beings. They walked upright like us, used tools, and had brains about 2/3 the size of modern humans. But here's what made them truly extraordinary. They survived. In conditions that would send today's toughest adventurers running for the nearest helicopter evacuation, they not only survived but raised children, passing on their genes and their knowledge to create the human lineage that would eventually lead to us. But how? How did these early humans, with no weapons more sophisticated than sharpened sticks, no shelters more secure than shallow caves, and no medicine beyond herbal remedies, manage to protect the most vulnerable members of their groups? The answer isn't just fascinating, it's a testament to human ingenuity, cooperation, and the fierce protective instinct that burns at the heart of our species. The first thing you need to understand about defending children 1 million years ago is that the threats were everywhere, and they were relentless. We're not talking about the occasional dangerous animal or the rare natural disaster. We're talking about a world where death lurked behind every tree, in every river, and even in the food they ate. The predators alone would give you nightmares. Massive, saber-toothed cats with fangs the length of kitchen knives stalked the grasslands, perfectly evolved killing machines that could take down prey many times their size. Cave bears, standing over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, claimed the very shelters our ancestors needed for protection. Giant hyenas, twice the size of their modern cousins, hunted in packs with bone-crushing jaws that could snap a human's spine like a twig. But the truly terrifying predators were the ones that specialized in hunting our kind of prey. Leopards had already developed a taste for primates, and our early human ancestors were just another item on their menu. These spotted killers were perfect ambush predators, capable of dragging a full-grown human up into a tree to feed at their leisure. Even worse, they often targeted the young, the small, the vulnerable. Then there were the pack hunters, ancestral wolves, wild dogs, and hunting hyenas that worked together with coordinated precision that would make a modern military unit envious. They understood that humans were social creatures, and they developed tactics specifically designed to separate individuals from the group, isolating the weak before moving in for the kill. The environmental threats were just as deadly. Rivers that seemed calm could hide crocodilian predators 20 feet long. Ancient monsters that made today's Nile crocodiles look like house pets. Seasonal floods could wash away entire camps without warning. Droughts could last for years, turning lush valleys into barren wastelands where water became more precious than any treasure. But perhaps most insidious of all were the invisible killers. Disease swept through early human populations like wildfire. Without understanding of germs or sanitation, a simple cut could become infected and fatal. Parasites were everywhere, weakening the strong and killing the weak. Food poisoning was a constant threat when every meal was a gamble between nutrition and death. And yet, despite all of this, despite threats that would make a modern horror movie seem tame, our ancestors found ways to protect their young. The key wasn't individual heroism or superior strength. The key was something far more powerful and far more human: community. Early human groups weren't just collections of individuals trying to survive. They were intricate social networks built around one primary goal: ensuring the survival of the next generation. Every adult in the group had a role to play in protecting every child, not just their own offspring, but all the children who represented the future of their people. The first line of defense was vigilance. In a world where letting your guard down for even a moment could be fatal, early humans developed a system of constant awareness that modern security experts would admire. While some members of the group foraged for food, others kept watch. While some slept, others maintained vigil through the dark hours when most predators preferred to hunt. This wasn't casual observation. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans developed sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, tracking patterns and environmental signs. They could read the landscape like a book, interpreting bird calls that warned of approaching predators, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated a watering hole might be claimed by dangerous animals, understanding wind patterns that could carry scent to potential threats. Children were never left alone, ever. From the moment they could walk, young humans were surrounded by a protective network of adults and older children who understood that survival depended on collective vigilance. Mothers carried infants constantly, not just for bonding or feeding, but because a baby left unattended for even a few minutes could vanish forever into the jaws of a waiting predator. But carrying a child while trying to gather food, make tools, or flee from danger created its own challenges. Early human mothers developed carrying techniques that seem almost magical in their efficiency. Using woven grass slings, animal hide wraps, and ingenious knots, they could secure a child to their body in ways that left their hands free while keeping the baby safe and comfortable. These weren't simple solutions. Archaeological reconstructions of early carrying devices show sophisticated understanding of weight distribution, child development, and ergonomics. A mother might carry her infant through an entire day of foraging, covering miles of difficult terrain, climbing rocky outcrops, and wading through streams, all while keeping the child secure and protected. The group's protective strategies extended far beyond individual vigilance. Early humans were master tacticians when it came to choosing campsites, establishing defensive positions, and creating escape routes. They didn't just find shelter, they engineered safety. When selecting a place to sleep, early human groups looked for locations that were naturally defensible. Rocky overhangs that protected from above, while limiting the directions from which predators could approach. Elevated positions that provided clear views of surrounding terrain, areas near water sources that were essential for survival, but positioned to avoid the most dangerous watering spots, where large predators gathered. But even the best natural shelter needed enhancement. Using nothing but stone tools and their bare hands, early humans modified their environment to create safer spaces for their families. They built barriers from thorny branches, creating painful obstacles that would slow or deter approaching predators. They dug shallow trenches around sleeping areas, not deep enough to provide serious protection, but sufficient to give warning when something large approached in the darkness. Fire was perhaps their most powerful tool for protection. The ability to create and maintain fire didn't just provide warmth and cooking capability, it created a sphere of safety in a world of darkness. Most predators feared fire instinctively, and early humans learned to use this fear as a weapon. They built multiple fires around their campsites, creating overlapping circles of protection that kept the most dangerous night hunters at bay. But maintaining fire required constant attention, and in a group where every adult had multiple responsibilities, this created challenges. Early humans developed rotation systems where different individuals took responsibility for keeping the fires burning throughout the night. This wasn't just about adding fuel to flames. It required understanding of wood types, burn rates, wind conditions, and the delicate balance between creating enough light to deter predators while not creating so much smoke that it attracted attention from hostile human groups. The protective strategies weren't just reactive, they were proactive. Early human groups developed early warning systems that would impress modern military strategists. They established sentry points at the edges of their territory, positions where watchers could observe approaching threats while remaining hidden themselves. They created signal systems using smoke, reflected sunlight, or coordinated calls that could communicate danger across vast distances. When threats were detected, the group's response was swift and coordinated. Children were immediately gathered into the center of the group, surrounded by a protective wall of adults armed with whatever weapons were available. The strongest and most experienced fighters moved to the perimeter, while others prepared escape routes and gathered essential supplies in case retreat became necessary. But sometimes retreat wasn't possible. Sometimes the threat was too close, too fast, or the terrain offered no escape route. In these moments, early human groups had to stand and fight, and their tactics for protecting children during combat were both ingenious and heartbreaking. Adults would form human shields around the youngest members of the group, literally placing their own bodies between their children and death. But this wasn't just desperate bravery, it was calculated strategy. By creating multiple layers of protection, they ensured that even if the outer defenses fell, the children still had a chance to survive. The weapons they used were simple but effective, sharpened sticks that could keep a predator at spear's length, heavy rocks that could crush skulls or break bones, firebrands that could blind and burn attacking animals. But perhaps most importantly, they used coordination and teamwork to multiply the effectiveness of their primitive arsenal. A single human with a pointed stick was vulnerable prey, but 10 humans working together, with spears coordinated to attack from multiple angles, presented a much more formidable challenge to even the largest predators. They developed tactics where some members would distract or engage a threat while others moved to attack from flanking positions. They learned to use terrain to their advantage, forcing predators into positions where their size and strength became disadvantages rather than assets. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa shows the remains of ancient battles where early humans successfully defended their camps against massive predators. Broken spear points embedded in fossilized bone, fire-hardened stakes arranged in defensive patterns, and the scattered remains of saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas tell stories of desperate struggles where human ingenuity and cooperation triumphed over raw predatory power. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early human child protection wasn't the dramatic battles or clever defensive strategies. It was the quiet, constant care that went into raising children who could survive in such a dangerous world. This wasn't just about keeping them alive until they reached adulthood. It was about preparing them to face the same challenges and protect the next generation. From the earliest age, children were taught to recognize danger signs, to move quietly through dangerous terrain, to understand the subtle communications that could mean the difference between life and death. They learned by watching, by participating in carefully supervised activities, and through games that were actually survival training disguised as play. Young children played hide-and-seek games that taught them to remain silent and motionless when predators were near. They practiced moving through undergrowth without making sound, learned to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, and developed the keen observational skills that would serve them throughout their lives. As they grew older, their training became more intensive and more dangerous. Teenage humans accompanied adults on hunting expeditions, not as full participants, but as observers who could learn tactics and strategies while remaining relatively protected. They learned to make and maintain tools, to read weather patterns, to track animals and understand their behavior. Most importantly, they learned the social structures and cooperative behaviors that made survival possible. Early human societies weren't just about individual strength or intelligence. They were about understanding your role in a complex web of relationships, where everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their part perfectly. But the education of young humans went far beyond practical skills. They were taught the stories that carried the accumulated wisdom of their people. Around evening fires, while adults maintained watch for predators, elders would share tales of past dangers and how they were overcome. These weren't just entertainment, they were survival manuals disguised as stories. A tale about a child who wandered too far from camp and was taken by a leopard wasn't meant to frighten, it was meant to teach. The story would include details about how leopards hunted, what signs warned of their presence, and what actions could prevent such tragedies. Children learned about seasonal migration patterns of dangerous animals, about which water sources were safe during different times of year, and about the subtle environmental changes that preceded natural disasters. The storytelling tradition served another crucial purpose. It created emotional bonds within the group that made the protective instinct even stronger. When every adult had heard the same stories, shared the same cultural knowledge, and understood their connection to the children around them, they were more likely to risk their own lives for protection. These weren't just random individuals thrown together by circumstance. They were family in the deepest sense of the word. The physical development of children was carefully monitored and actively encouraged. Early humans understood that weak children were vulnerable children, and they developed training regimens that would build strength, speed, and agility from the earliest possible age. But this wasn't brutal conditioning. It was play-based learning that built physical capabilities while maintaining the joy and curiosity essential for healthy development. Children learned to climb by playing games that required them to reach high places quickly. They developed running speed through chase games that mimicked escape scenarios. They built hand-eye coordination through throwing contests that prepared them to use weapons effectively. Every aspect of their physical education had a survival component, but it was delivered in ways that felt natural and enjoyable. The nutritional strategies used by early human groups were equally sophisticated. Feeding children in an environment where food was scarce and often dangerous required careful planning and deep knowledge of nutritional needs. Mothers learned to identify which foods provided the energy and nutrients growing bodies needed, and how to process potentially dangerous foods to make them safe. Certain foods that were perfectly safe for adults could be deadly for children. Early humans developed elaborate preparation techniques that removed toxins, broke down difficult-to-digest compounds, and concentrated nutrients. They understood that children needed different ratios of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates than adults, and they adjusted food distribution accordingly. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed sharing systems that ensured children ate first and best during times of scarcity. When food was plentiful, everyone ate well. But when resources were limited, adults would voluntarily reduce their own consumption to ensure the children received adequate nutrition. This wasn't just parental instinct, it was group survival strategy. A generation of malnourished children meant the extinction of the entire community. The medical knowledge possessed by early human groups was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Without understanding of germs or modern disease processes, They still developed treatments and preventive measures that kept their children healthier than might seem possible. They learned to identify and use medicinal plants that could treat common childhood ailments. Certain leaves could reduce fever, specific roots could ease digestive problems, and particular bark preparations could help heal wounds. This knowledge was passed down through generations, with the same care and precision as tool-making techniques or hunting strategies. Early humans also understood the importance of cleanliness in preventing illness, even if they didn't understand the scientific mechanisms involved. They developed bathing routines for children, kept sleeping areas clean, and disposed of waste in ways that reduced the risk of contamination. They observed that certain practices led to healthier children, and incorporated these observations into their daily routines. When children did become ill or injured, the group's response was immediate and comprehensive. Healing wasn't just the responsibility of a single individual. It was a community effort that drew on the knowledge and resources of everyone present. The most experienced healers would diagnose and treat the condition, while others provided support, gathered needed materials, and maintained the protective vigilance that continued even during medical crises. But the most powerful medicine available to early human children was something that modern science is only beginning to understand. The healing power of community support, of being surrounded by people who cared deeply about their well-being and were willing to sacrifice for their survival. This emotional security provided a foundation that helped children recover from trauma, overcome illness, and develop the resilience needed for life in such a challenging environment. The seasonal challenges faced by early human groups required different protective strategies throughout the year. During the dry season, when water sources were scarce and predators concentrated around the few remaining watering holes, groups had to balance the need for water with the increased danger of predator encounters. They developed complex timing strategies, sending scouts to determine when watering holes were safe and establishing defensive positions before bringing children to drink. The rainy season brought different challenges. Flash floods could wash away camps without warning, and the increased vegetation provided better cover for stalking predators. Children had to be taught to recognize the signs of approaching storms, to understand which areas were prone to flooding, and to move quickly to higher ground when necessary. Migration periods were perhaps the most dangerous times of all. When groups had to travel long distances to follow food sources or escape seasonal dangers, children were exposed to unfamiliar territories with unknown threats. The protective strategies used during these journeys were elaborate and carefully coordinated. Scouts would range ahead of the main group, identifying potential dangers and safe camping spots. The group would travel in a specific formation designed to protect the children, with the strongest fighters at the front and rear, and experienced hunters on the flanks. Children would be positioned in the center of the group, surrounded by protective adults at all times. Rest stops during migration were carefully chosen and heavily defended. Even brief pauses to rest or feed children required establishing perimeter security and escape routes. The group couldn't afford to be caught off guard by predators who might be following their trail or lying in ambush along their route. The psychological aspects of child protection were just as important as the physical strategies. Early human children lived in a world of constant danger, and without proper emotional support, the stress could be overwhelming. Adults worked carefully to balance the need to teach children about real dangers with the need to maintain their mental health and developmental progress. They used games, songs, and stories to help children process frightening experiences and build emotional resilience. When a child witnessed violence or experienced trauma, the community would come together to provide comfort and help the child understand what had happened in age-appropriate ways. But they also worked to maintain joy and wonder in children's lives. Despite the dangers surrounding them, early human children still played, laughed, and explored their world with curiosity. Adults understood that children who lived in constant fear wouldn't develop properly, so they created spaces and times where children could simply be children, protected and free to learn and grow. The development of these protective strategies wasn't something that happened overnight. It was the result of countless generations of trial and error, of learning from mistakes that often cost lives, and of gradually building a body of knowledge that could keep more and more children alive to adulthood. Each generation built on the lessons learned by their predecessors, refining techniques, developing new strategies, and passing on increasingly sophisticated knowledge. The parents who successfully protected their children shared their methods with others. The groups that developed effective defensive strategies survived and thrived, while those that didn't gradually disappeared. This evolutionary process wasn't just about physical survival techniques. It was about the development of human consciousness itself. Early humans were beginning to understand cause and effect in ways that went far beyond simple stimulus and response. They could anticipate future threats based on past experiences, plan complex strategies that required multiple steps, and most importantly, they could teach these concepts to their children. The ability to think ahead, to imagine scenarios that hadn't yet occurred, was perhaps the greatest protective advantage early humans possessed. While other animals relied primarily on instinct and immediate reaction, our ancestors could visualize potential dangers and prepare for them in advance. They could look at a peaceful watering hole and imagine the leopard that might be hiding in the nearby rocks. They could see storm clouds on the horizon and begin preparing shelter before the first drops of rain fell. This cognitive leap allowed them to create what we might call the first early warning systems. Not just the physical signals and sentries we discussed earlier, but mental models of how their world worked. They began to understand seasonal patterns, animal behavior cycles, and environmental changes in ways that let them predict and prepare for threats before they materialized. Children were taught to think this way from their earliest years. Instead of simply reacting to immediate dangers, they learned to scan their environment constantly, looking for the subtle signs that preceded trouble. A particular bird call that meant predators were approaching, the way grass moved when something large was stalking through it, the smell that carried on the wind before a storm arrived. But this heightened awareness came with a cost. Living in constant vigilance was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Early human groups had to develop ways to manage this stress, to create periods of relative relaxation while still maintaining the alertness necessary for survival. They learned to take turns bearing the heaviest burden of vigilance, rotating responsibilities so that no individual became overwhelmed by the constant pressure. The social structures that emerged around child protection were remarkably sophisticated. Each adult in the group had specific roles and responsibilities that contributed to the overall safety of the children. Some individuals were natural scouts, with keen eyesight and the ability to move silently through dangerous terrain. Others were better suited to direct combat, with the strength and courage needed to face down attacking predators. Still others excelled at the nurturing and educational aspects of childcare, providing the emotional support and knowledge transfer that kept children mentally healthy and properly prepared for their dangerous world. These weren't arbitrary assignments. Early human groups learned to recognize individual strengths and talents, and they organized their protective strategies around maximizing each person's contributions. A group might have one individual who was exceptionally good at reading weather patterns, another who could track animals across any terrain, and a third who had an almost supernatural ability to sense approaching danger. The specialization went even deeper than individual skills. Different groups developed different approaches to child protection based on their local environments and the specific threats they faced. Groups living near rivers developed sophisticated techniques for protecting children from aquatic predators and flash floods. Those in mountainous regions became experts at using terrain for defensive advantage and teaching children to navigate treacherous rocky surfaces. Desert-dwelling groups developed strategies for protecting children from extreme heat and dehydration, while those in forested areas specialized in concealment techniques and protection from the many predators that used use trees for ambush hunting. But despite these regional differences, all successful groups shared certain fundamental principles that seemed to be universal requirements for keeping children alive. The first universal principle was redundancy. No single individual, technique, or strategy was ever relied upon completely. If the primary watchman became ill, there were backup sentries trained and ready. If the main water source became contaminated or dangerous, the group knew of alternative locations. If their preferred shelter was compromised, they had identified secondary and tertiary options. This redundancy extended to every aspect of child protection. Multiple adults were trained in basic medical treatment so that the loss of the primary healer wouldn't doom an injured child. Several group members knew the locations of emergency food sources, ensuring that children could be fed even if normal foraging areas became too dangerous to access. The second universal principle was adaptability. Successful groups never became so attached to a particular strategy or location that they couldn't change when circumstances demanded it. They understood that their dangerous world was constantly changing, and their protective methods had to evolve accordingly. When a new type of predator appeared in their territory, they quickly developed countermeasures. When environmental changes altered their landscape, they modified their defensive strategies to match the new conditions. When children reached different developmental stages, the protective approaches were adjusted to match their changing needs and capabilities. This adaptability wasn't just reactive, it was proactive. Early human groups were constantly experimenting with new techniques, testing different approaches, and refining their methods based on the results. They understood that survival depended on continuous improvement, on never becoming complacent about the threats they faced. The third universal principle was communication. Successful child protection required seamless coordination between all members of the group, and this was only possible through sophisticated communication systems that went far beyond simple spoken language. Early humans developed intricate networks of signals, gestures, and calls that could convey complex information quickly and quietly. A particular whistle pattern might warn of approaching predators while indicating their type, number, and direction of approach. A series of hand signals could coordinate a defensive response without alerting the threat to the group's awareness. Children were taught these communication systems as early as they learned to speak. They understood that their survival might depend on their ability to receive and relay critical information instantly and accurately. A child who spotted danger had to be able to communicate the threat to adults immediately, and they had to do it in ways that wouldn't panic the group or alert the predator to their awareness. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early human communication was its emotional component. These groups developed ways to provide comfort, reassurance, and encouragement through subtle signals that could be used even in the most dangerous situations. A touch, a look, a barely audible sound could let a frightened child know they were protected and loved, even when speaking aloud might attract deadly attention. The fourth universal principle was education, but not the kind of formal instruction we might recognize today. Early human children learned through immersion in their dangerous world, gradually taking on more responsibility and facing greater challenges as their skills and judgment developed. This education began before children could even walk. Infants were carried through the daily activities of the group, absorbing the rhythms of vigilance and protection through constant exposure. They learned to recognize the sounds, smells, and sights of their world before they had words to describe them. As they grew, children were given increasingly important roles in the group's protective activities. They might start by simply staying quiet when adults signaled danger, then progress to helping gather emergency supplies, then to serving as messengers during crises, and eventually to taking their own turns at sentry duty. Each stage of this education was carefully calibrated to match the child's developmental capabilities, while gradually building the skills they would need as adults. The goal wasn't just to keep children safe in the short term, but to prepare them to protect their own families and communities in the future. The teaching methods were ingenious in their simplicity and effectiveness. Instead of abstract lessons, children learned through stories that embedded crucial survival information in memorable narratives. They practiced essential skills through games that felt like play, but built real competencies. They observed adult activities constantly, picking up subtle techniques and strategies through careful attention to detail. Most importantly, they learned that their individual survival was inseparably connected to the welfare of the group. Children who tried to face dangers alone, who hoarded resources for themselves, or who failed to contribute to the collective protective effort were not just risking their own lives, they were endangering everyone around them. The fifth universal principle was sacrifice, but not the dramatic, heroic sacrifice we see in movies. It was the quiet, daily sacrifice of putting the group's needs ahead of individual desires, of sharing resources when sharing meant going without, of taking risks to protect others when safety would have meant looking out for yourself alone. Adults regularly gave up their own comfort, safety, and even food to ensure that children were protected. But children also learned to make sacrifices for the group. They gave up playtime to help with essential tasks. They shared their favorite foods with hungry siblings. They remained quiet and still during long, frightening watches, when every instinct told them to move and make noise. These sacrifices weren't seen as burdens or hardships. They were understood as the price of survival, the fundamental reality of life in a world where individual selfishness meant collective extinction. Children who learned to make these sacrifices willingly and cheerfully were praised and celebrated. Those who struggled with putting group needs first received patient teaching and support until they understood the vital importance of cooperation. The genetic and cultural evolution that resulted from these protective strategies was remarkable. Over thousands of generations, early human groups that were most successful at protecting their children passed on not just their genes, but their knowledge, techniques, and social structures. The traits that made individuals better at child protection became more common in the human population. Physical characteristics that helped with child protection were naturally selected for. Better eyesight for spotting distant threats. Enhanced hearing for detecting approaching predators. Increased lung capacity for the endurance needed during long migrations with children. Stronger arms and backs for carrying children while performing other essential tasks. But the psychological and social traits were even more important. Individuals who were naturally inclined to put group welfare ahead of personal interest were more likely to be part of successful child-rearing groups. Those with better emotional regulation could remain calm and effective during crises. People with enhanced empathy were better at understanding and meeting children's needs. Most crucially, individuals who were good at learning, teaching, and adapting were essential for groups that needed to constantly improve their protective strategies. The ability to observe successful techniques, understand why they worked, modify them for new situations, and pass them on to others became one of the most valuable traits a human could possess. The cumulative effect of this evolutionary pressure was extraordinary. Early human groups became incredibly sophisticated at protecting their young, developing strategies and techniques that rival anything modern humans have created for similar purposes. They built social structures that were specifically optimized for child survival. They created educational systems that prepared children for their dangerous world while maintaining their psychological health. They developed technologies and tactics that maximize their defensive capabilities despite their limited resources. But perhaps most remarkably, they did all of this while maintaining the essential humanity that makes us who we are. Despite living in a world of constant danger, early human children still experience love, joy, curiosity, and wonder. Adults still found ways to laugh, to play, to express creativity and beauty, even in the midst of their struggle for survival. The archaeological record shows us evidence of early humans creating art, making music, and engaging in activities that had no immediate survival value, but that enriched their lives and strengthened their communities. Children's toys have been found at sites across Africa. Simple objects carved from wood or stone that served no purpose other than to bring joy to young lives. This balance between survival necessity and human flourishing was perhaps the greatest achievement of our early ancestors. They found ways to protect their children without crushing their spirits, to prepare them for danger without destroying their capacity for happiness, to teach them vigilance without robbing them of trust and wonder. The stories of these ancient families struggling to raise their children in impossible circumstances remind us of something profound about human nature. The drive to protect our young isn't just about biological imperative or species survival. It's about love in its purest form, the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who cannot protect themselves. When we look at the fossil evidence, the ancient tools, the remains of early human settlements, we're seeing the physical traces of that love. Every defensive structure they built, every weapon they crafted, every technique they developed was motivated by the simple desire to see their children live another day, to grow up strong and healthy, to have the chance to experience all the beauty and wonder that life could offer. These early humans didn't have our modern advantages. They couldn't call for help when danger threatened. They couldn't rely on advanced medicine to heal serious injuries. They couldn't escape to safe havens when their environment became too dangerous. All they had was each other, their ingenuity, and their unshakable commitment to protecting the next generation. And somehow, against odds that seem impossible, they succeeded. Not just in keeping some of their children alive, but in raising them to be capable, caring adults who would continue the cycle of protection for their own offspring. They created an unbroken chain of successful child protection that stretches from their time to ours, a legacy of love and sacrifice that continues to this day. The techniques and strategies they developed weren't just solutions to immediate problems. They were the foundation of human civilization itself. The cooperation they needed to protect their children became the basis for all future human societies. The knowledge they passed down became the beginning of human culture. The bonds they formed in the crucible of shared danger became the template for families, communities, and nations. Every time a modern parent instinctively moves to protect their child from danger, they're expressing the same protective instinct that kept our species alive through its most vulnerable early stages. Every time we organize communities around the welfare of children, we're following patterns established by our earliest ancestors. Every time we sacrifice individual advantage for the good of the next generation, we're honoring the legacy of those ancient humans who faced impossible odds and refused to give up. Their story isn't just about the past. It's about the enduring power of human love, the incredible things ordinary people can accomplish when they're motivated by the desire to protect those they care about, and the remarkable resilience of children who grow up knowing they are valued and protected by their community. In our modern world, with all its safety and security, we sometimes forget how precious and fragile life can be. The story of our earliest ancestors reminds us that every child who survives to adulthood represents a victory against enormous odds, a triumph of love over danger, of hope over despair. The next time you see a parent protectively guiding their child across a busy street, remember that you're witnessing the continuation of a story that began over 1 million years ago. The same instinct that drove our earliest ancestors to face down saber-toothed cats is still alive in us today, still protecting children, still ensuring that human love and courage triumph over whatever challenges we face. But the most ingenious defensive innovation our ancestors developed wasn't a weapon or a shelter. It was something far more revolutionary. They learned to weaponize their own vulnerability. You see, early humans were physically outmatched by almost every predator they faced. They couldn't outrun a hunting cat, couldn't overpower a cave bear, couldn't climb faster than a leopard, but they had something no other animal possessed. The ability to think several moves ahead, to turn their weaknesses into strengths through pure cunning. When a group of early humans encountered a massive predator that couldn't be fought or outrun, they developed what we might call psychological warfare. They learned to make themselves appear larger and more dangerous than they actually were. Using coordinated shouting, synchronized movements, and the strategic use of fire, they could create the illusion of a much more formidable opponent. Picture this scene. A pack of giant hyenas approaches a human campsite where children are sleeping. Instead of fleeing or cowering, the adults spread out in a wide formation, each holding burning branches above their heads. They begin making noise, not random screaming, but coordinated calls that echo off rocks and trees, multiplying the sound until it seems like a massive army is present. They move in synchronized patterns that make it impossible for the predators to count their actual numbers. The hyenas, evolved to hunt prey that either fled in panic or fought predictably, suddenly face something completely outside their experience. These strange creatures seemed to be growing larger, multiplying, making sounds they'd never heard before. The uncertainty was enough to make most predators reconsider their attack. Why risk injury fighting unknown opponents when easier prey was available elsewhere? But this psychological warfare required incredible coordination and nerves of steel. Everyone in the group had to play their role perfectly, including the children. Kids as young as 5 or 6 learned to participate in these defensive displays, adding their voices to the coordinated noise, helping to wave burning branches, moving in formation with the adults. One person, breaking character or panicking, could shatter the illusion and doom the entire group. The training for these defensive displays was extensive and ongoing. Children practiced during safe daylight hours, learning the calls, the movements, the timing that could mean the difference between life and death. They rehearsed different scenarios depending on what type of predator they might face. The display used against pack hunters was different from the one used against solitary stalkers. The formation for defending against ground predators differed from protection against threats that could attack from above. These weren't just random intimidation tactics. They were sophisticated psychological profiles of different predator species, developed through generations of careful observation. Early humans understood that cave bears responded differently to certain stimuli than saber-toothed cats did. They knew which predators were more likely to be deterred by fire, which ones were frightened by loud noises, and which ones could be confused by coordinated movement patterns. The children who grew up learning these techniques didn't just memorize the actions. They internalized the psychology behind them. They learned to read predator body language, to recognize the signs that indicated whether a threat was genuinely committed to attacking or just investigating. They developed the ability to project confidence even when terrified, to maintain coordination even in the face of mortal danger. But psychological warfare was just one layer of their defensive strategy. Early humans also became masters of environmental manipulation. They didn't just adapt to their surroundings, they actively modified the landscape around their camps to create tactical advantages. Using nothing but stone tools and incredible patience, they would spend days or even weeks preparing defensive positions. They dug shallow pits, lined with sharpened stakes, not deep enough to be obvious traps, but sufficient to injure or slow attacking predators. They arranged rocks and fallen logs to create obstacles that would channel approaching threats into predetermined killing zones where multiple defenders could attack simultaneously. They built elevated platforms in trees, not just for lookouts, but as emergency refugees where children could be lifted to safety if ground-based defenses failed. These platforms were carefully constructed to support the weight of multiple children while being too high and too small for most predators to reach. Getting children into these refugees quickly required practice choreography, with each adult knowing exactly which child they were responsible for lifting to safety. the most elaborate defensive modifications involved water sources. Early humans learned to dig channels and build stone barriers that could redirect streams to create temporary moats around their camps during times of extreme danger. They constructed hidden underwater obstacles that would trap or injure aquatic predators attempting to attack children who were drinking or bathing. These engineering projects required incredible foresight and community cooperation. Adults would work for days moving massive stones, digging channels, and building structures that might never be needed. But when danger did threaten, these preparations could make the difference between successful defense and catastrophic loss. Children participated in these construction projects from an early age, not just as helpers, but as students learning the principles behind defensive engineering. They learned to evaluate terrain for natural advantages, to identify materials suitable for construction, and to understand the tactical thinking that went into creating defensive positions. The seasonal aspects of child protection required even more sophisticated planning. Early human groups had to anticipate dangers that might not materialize for months, preparing for threats that changed with weather patterns, animal migrations, and resource availability. During the wet season, when many predators were driven to higher ground and concentrated in smaller areas, human groups would establish multiple emergency campsites in advance. They would pre-position supplies, build preliminary shelters, and create escape routes between safe locations. If their primary camp became untenable due to flooding or predator pressure, they could move quickly to prepared backup positions without losing the defensive advantages they'd worked so hard to create. The dry season brought different challenges that required different preparations. As water sources dwindled, predators became more desperate and more willing to take risks attacking human settlements. Our ancestors learned to identify water sources that could be defended effectively and those that were too dangerous to use even during severe droughts. They developed elaborate water storage systems using animal bladders, woven baskets lined with tree sap, and natural rock formations to collect and preserve water during abundant times. This wasn't just about having enough to drink. Water was a weapon that could be used to extinguish fires set by lightning strikes, to clean wounds that might otherwise become infected, and to maintain the cleanliness that helped prevent disease outbreaks. But the most critical seasonal preparation involved food storage and processing. Children needed consistent nutrition to develop properly, but food sources in the prehistoric world were unpredictable and often dangerous to obtain. Early human groups became incredibly sophisticated at preserving and storing food in ways that kept it safe from both spoilage and theft by other animals. They learned to smoke meat in ways that not only preserved it, but made it more digestible for young children. They developed techniques for processing tough plant materials into nutritious pastes that infants could eat safely. They identified and cultivated plants that were naturally rich in the vitamins and minerals growing children needed most. The food storage locations were as carefully planned as their defensive positions. Caches were hidden in multiple locations, protected from weather and scavengers, and positioned so they could be accessed even if the main camp had to be abandoned quickly. Each cache contained not just food, but basic tools and materials needed to establish a new defensive position. Children learned the locations of these food caches as part of their survival education, but they also learned the strict protocols around accessing them. Emergency supplies weren't for casual use, and children had to understand the difference between genuine need and simple desire. The discipline required to pass by a cache of stored food when hungry, saving it for true emergencies, was one of the hardest lessons young humans had to master. The medical knowledge possessed by early human groups extended far beyond simple herbal remedies. They developed sophisticated understanding of child development, nutrition, and the treatment of injuries that would be considered advanced, even by some modern standards. They understood that children's bodies responded differently to treatments than adult bodies did, and they modified their medical practices accordingly. Dosages of medicinal plants were carefully calculated based on a child's size and age. treatment techniques were adapted to account for children's faster healing rates, but greater vulnerability to certain types of injuries. Early human healers learned to recognize the early signs of developmental problems and malnutrition, intervening before these conditions became life-threatening. They developed feeding strategies for children who couldn't digest normal foods, exercise routines for those with physical limitations, and behavioral techniques for managing children who might be what we would now recognize as neurodivergent. The psychological aspects of medical treatment were just as important as the physical interventions. Children who were injured or sick needed emotional support to recover properly, but providing this support in a dangerous environment required careful balance. Healers learned to provide comfort and reassurance while maintaining the vigilance necessary to protect vulnerable patients from external threats. They developed techniques for treating children's injuries without causing additional trauma, understanding that a child who became afraid of medical treatment might hide future injuries or illnesses rather than seek help. They created calming rituals around medical procedures, using songs, stories, and gentle touch to help children cooperate with necessary treatments. The community support systems around child healthcare were remarkable in their sophistication. When a child was seriously injured or ill, the entire group would reorganize their activities to support the healing process. Hunters would focus on obtaining foods known to promote recovery. Craftspeople would create specialized tools or equipment needed for treatment. Guards would maintain extra vigilance to protect the vulnerable child and the adults caring for them. But perhaps most importantly, other children in the group would be mobilized to provide emotional support to their injured or sick peer. Early humans understood that children often responded better to comfort from other children than from adults, and they encouraged healthy children to participate in the care of those who were struggling. These support systems weren't just reactive responses to medical crises. They were proactive community structures designed to maintain the physical and mental health of all children in the group. Regular health monitoring was built into daily routines, with experienced adults checking each child for signs of injury, illness, or developmental problems. The educational aspects of medical knowledge were carefully managed to balance the need for children to understand their bodies and health with the need to avoid creating unnecessary anxiety about illness or injury. Children learned basic first aid techniques appropriate to their age and capabilities. They understood how to recognize serious symptoms that required immediate adult attention. They knew which plants and materials could be used for basic wound care, and which ones were dangerous to touch. But they also learned that medicine was a community responsibility, not an individual burden. No child was expected to diagnose or treat serious medical problems alone. The knowledge they received was designed to help them provide initial assistance and seek appropriate help, not to make them feel responsible for outcomes beyond their control. The integration of medical knowledge with other survival skills created children who were remarkably resilient and capable. They understood their bodies as tools that needed proper maintenance and care. They recognized the connections between nutrition, exercise, rest, and their ability to contribute to the group's survival. They learned to push through minor discomforts without complaint while still communicating about serious problems that needed attention. The emotional intelligence required for successful child protection in such a dangerous environment was extraordinary. Early human adults had to maintain their own mental health while providing stability and security for children who were constantly exposed to trauma and stress. They developed techniques for helping children process frightening experiences without becoming paralyzed by fear. When children witnessed violence, death, or other traumatic events, adults had specific protocols for providing immediate comfort, explaining what had happened in age-appropriate terms, and helping the child integrate the experience without lasting psychological damage. These weren't formal therapy sessions as we might recognize them today. They were conversations around evening fires, stories that helped children understand that danger was part of life, but didn't define life, and gentle guidance that helped young minds make sense of experiences that adults sometimes struggled to comprehend themselves. The adults also had to model emotional regulation for the children in their care. Children learned how to respond to danger, not just through explicit instruction, but by watching how the adults around them handled fear, stress, and uncertainty. Adults who could remain calm during crises, make rational decisions under pressure, and maintain hope in desperate situations were teaching essential life skills through their example. But this emotional modeling came with enormous personal costs. Adults had to suppress their own fear, grief, and despair in order to provide the stability children needed. They had to make life and death decisions while appearing confident and controlled. They had to continue functioning at peak performance even when they were exhausted, injured, or mourning losses of their own. The support systems that early human groups developed for their adult members were crucial for maintaining effective child protection. Adults who were overwhelmed by their own emotional burdens couldn't provide the care and protection children needed. The community had to find ways to support the supporters, creating networks of mutual aid that kept everyone functioning despite the enormous pressures they faced. These support systems included rotating responsibilities so that no individual carried the heaviest burdens for extended periods. They involved shared decision-making processes that distributed the weight of difficult choices across multiple people. Most importantly, they created opportunities for adults to express their own fears and struggles in safe settings where they could receive comfort and guidance without compromising their ability to protect children. The rituals and ceremonies that emerged around child protection served multiple functions beyond their obvious spiritual and cultural purposes. They created regular opportunities for the community to recommit to their shared values and responsibilities. They provided structured ways to honor those who had made sacrifices for children's welfare. They offered healing and closure after traumatic events that had affected the group's youngest members. But perhaps most importantly, these rituals created shared meaning around the struggles and sacrifices that child protection required. They transformed individual acts of courage and selflessness into community narratives that inspired others and provided models for behavior during future crises. Children participated in these ceremonies from infancy, absorbing the values and commitments that would guide their own behavior as they matured. They learned that protecting the vulnerable wasn't just a practical necessity, but a sacred responsibility that connected them to their ancestors and to the future generations they would eventually be responsible for protecting. The stories told during these ceremonies weren't just entertainment or moral instruction. They were detailed case studies of successful and unsuccessful protective strategies, passed down through generations and constantly updated, based on new experiences and changing circumstances. Children learned tactical and strategic information through narratives that were memorable and engaging, ensuring that crucial knowledge would be retained and applied when needed.
Abi,
The ceremonies also served as testing grounds for the community's preparedness. During ritual reenactments of past dangers, children and adults would practice their protective responses in controlled environments, where mistakes wouldn't be fatal. These weren't casual drills, but elaborate productions that recreated the stress and chaos of real emergencies, while allowing the group to identify weaknesses in their defensive strategies. A ceremony might involve simulating a night attack by cave bears, with some community members playing the role of predators, while others practice their coordinated defensive responses. Children learn to move quickly to designated safe positions. Adults rehearse their combat formations, and everyone practiced the communication signals that could mean the difference between coordinated defense and deadly confusion. These ritual practices were brutally honest about past failures as well as successes. When a child had been lost to predators or accidents, the community would analyze what had gone wrong, not to assign blame, but to identify lessons that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. Children learned from these stories that mistakes were part of survival, but that learning from mistakes was what separated thriving groups from extinct ones. The psychological impact of these ceremonies extended far beyond their practical training value. They created a sense of continuity and purpose that helped both children and adults cope with the constant threat of death. By connecting current struggles to the experiences of past generations and future hopes, the rituals provided meaning that transcended immediate survival needs. Children who participated in these ceremonies developed what we might call inherited courage. They learned that facing danger wasn't about being unafraid, but about acting correctly despite fear. They understood that their own safety was part of a larger story that included ancestors who had faced similar challenges and descendants who would depend on the knowledge being passed down. The technological innovations that emerged from child protection needs were remarkable in their ingenuity and effectiveness. Early humans didn't just adapt existing tools for defensive purposes. They invented entirely new categories of technology specifically designed to keep children safe in dangerous environments. One of their most brilliant innovations was the development of portable early warning systems. Using carefully arranged stones, stretched animal sinews, and strategically placed hollow reeds, they created perimeter alarms that could detect approaching predators, even when human sentries were asleep or distracted. These systems were sensitive enough to distinguish between the movements of dangerous animals and harmless environmental disturbances like wind or small prey animals. The construction and maintenance of these alarm systems required sophisticated understanding of physics, animal behavior, and environmental conditions. Children learned to help build and maintain these devices as part of their technical education, understanding not just how they worked, but why they were designed in specific ways. They developed specialized tools for rapid child evacuation, including lightweight stretchers that could carry multiple injured or exhausted children simultaneously, and portable shelters that could be assembled in minutes to protect children during sudden weather emergencies or predator encounters. The materials used in these technologies were carefully selected and processed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing weight and bulk. Early humans learned to identify plant fibers with specific tensile strengths, animal parts with particular flexibility or durability characteristics, and mineral components that provided the exact properties needed for their protective devices. But perhaps their most sophisticated technological achievement was the development of modular defensive systems that could be rapidly assembled in different configurations depending on the specific threat being faced. Using standardized components that could be quickly connected in various patterns, they could create barriers, weapons platforms, and evacuation routes that were perfectly adapted to immediate circumstances. These systems required not just individual technical knowledge, but coordinated understanding across the entire community. Everyone had to know how the components fit together, which configurations were appropriate for different situations, and how to assemble complex defensive structures under extreme time pressure while potentially under attack. The training required to master these technologies was intensive and ongoing. Children began learning basic component assembly as soon as they could manipulate small objects accurately. As they grew, they progressed to more complex configurations and eventually to the improvisation and innovation that allowed the technology to continue evolving. The psychological training that accompanied this technical education was equally important. Children learned to remain calm and focused while assembling critical defensive systems, understanding that mistakes made under pressure could doom the entire group. They practiced working together seamlessly, coordinating their efforts without the verbal communication that might alert predators to their activities. The seasonal migration patterns followed by early human groups were masterpieces of strategic planning that prioritized child safety while maintaining access to essential resources. These weren't random wanderings, but carefully planned journeys that took advantage of predictable environmental changes while avoiding known dangers during their peak intensity. The timing of these migrations was calculated with precision that would impress modern logistics experts. Groups had to move early enough to avoid seasonal predator concentrations, but late enough to ensure adequate food and water would be available at their destinations. They had to account for the slower travel speeds necessitated by moving with children while still covering enough ground to stay ahead of environmental changes. The routes themselves were the result of generations of accumulated knowledge about safe passages, reliable water sources, and defensible stopping points. Each migration path had been tested and refined through countless journeys, with alternative routes identified for use when primary paths became too dangerous or impassable. The preparation for these journeys began weeks before departure. Food had to be processed and packed for transport. Tools and weapons needed maintenance and repair. Children required physical conditioning to build the endurance needed for long-distance travel through difficult terrain. But the most critical preparation was psychological. Children had to understand what they would face during migration, how they would be expected to behave, and what their specific responsibilities would be. They learned that migration periods required different rules than settled life, with stricter discipline and less tolerance for individual preferences that might compromise group safety. The actual travel formations used during migration were sophisticated tactical arrangements that maximized protection while maintaining mobility. The strongest fighters positioned themselves at the front and rear of the group, where they could respond quickly to threats approaching from either direction. Experienced scouts ranged ahead and to the sides, identifying dangers and safe passage routes. Children were positioned in the center of the formation, surrounded by protective adults at all times. But this protection came with responsibilities. Children had to maintain the pace set by the group, follow movement signals instantly and without question, and contribute to camp setup and breakdown despite their fatigue. The daily routines during migration were carefully choreographed to minimize vulnerability while covering necessary ground. The group would wake before dawn, break camp quickly and quietly, and begin moving while many predators were still inactive. Rest stops were brief and heavily guarded, with sentries posted immediately whenever the group paused. Evening camp setup was a race against approaching darkness, with everyone having specific assigned tasks that had to be completed before predators became active. Children participated in this setup not as helpers, but as essential team members whose contributions were necessary for the group's survival. The psychological challenges of migration were enormous, especially for children. They had to leave familiar surroundings where they understood the dangers and defensive measures, venturing into unknown territories where threats might come from unexpected directions. They had to maintain discipline and cooperation despite exhaustion, discomfort, and fear. Adults worked constantly to maintain group morale during these difficult journeys. They told stories during rest periods that reminded children of successful past migrations. They celebrated small victories like finding good water sources or avoiding dangerous areas. Most importantly, they maintained the emotional connections that gave children the motivation to continue despite hardships. The arrival at seasonal destinations wasn't the end of migration challenges, but the beginning of new ones. Each new location required rapid assessment of threats, establishment of defensive positions, and integration with local environmental conditions. Children had to quickly learn new dangers specific to unfamiliar territories while helping establish the protective systems that would keep them safe. The knowledge management systems developed by early human groups were extraordinary in their sophistication and effectiveness. These communities had to preserve information across generations without transmit vast amounts of survival, any form of written language, relying entirely on memory, oral tradition, and practical demonstration. The information that needed preservation wasn't just simple facts, but complex interconnected knowledge systems that included seasonal patterns, animal behavior, plant identification, tool construction techniques, defensive strategies, medical treatments, and social protocols. This knowledge had to remain accurate despite being passed through multiple generations of human memory. Early humans developed mnemonic techniques that embedded survival information in memorable stories, songs, and ritualized activities. Children learned essential facts through narratives that were engaging enough to stick in memory, but structured enough to preserve accurate details. Complex technical procedures were encoded in rhythmic chants that made the sequences easier to remember and execute correctly. The teaching methods used to transmit this knowledge were carefully designed to accommodate different learning styles and abilities. Some children learned best through visual demonstration, others through hands-on practice, still others through verbal explanation. Master teachers learned to present the same information in multiple formats to ensure every child could absorb and retain what they needed to know. But the most sophisticated aspect of their knowledge management was the error-checking systems they developed to ensure information remained accurate over time. Critical survival knowledge was taught by multiple teachers, learned through multiple methods, and regularly tested through practical application. When discrepancies appeared between different versions of the same information, the community would investigate to determine which version was correct. The social structures that supported this knowledge transmission were complex networks of teaching relationships that extended far beyond simple parent-child instruction. Every adult was expected to contribute to every child's education, sharing their specialized knowledge and skills. Every child was expected to learn from multiple teachers, gaining redundant instruction that reduced the risk of critical information being lost or corrupted. The seasonal cycles of teaching matched the natural rhythms of their dangerous world. During safe periods, children received intensive instruction in complex skills that required focused attention. During dangerous times, teaching focused on immediate survival needs and emergency procedures that might be needed without warning. The graduation systems that marked children's progression through different levels of knowledge and responsibility were elaborate ceremonies that tested not just information retention, but practical application under stress. A child might be required to demonstrate complex tool construction while maintaining watch for predators, or to navigate through dangerous terrain while carrying emergency supplies for the group. These tests weren't just academic exercises, but genuine evaluations of readiness for increased responsibility and independence. Children who passed these assessments were granted greater freedom and more important roles in group survival activities. Those who weren't ready received additional training and support until they could meet the required standards. The most advanced students became teaching assistants, helping to instruct younger children while continuing their own education. This system ensured that knowledge transmission continued even if adult teachers were lost to accidents or predator attacks, and it reinforced learning by requiring students to explain concepts to others. The innovation processes that allowed early human groups to continuously improve their child protection. Strategies were remarkable examples of prehistoric research and development. These communities didn't just preserve existing knowledge, they actively experimented with new techniques and technologies to better protect their most vulnerable members. The experimentation was systematic rather than random, with careful observation of results and thoughtful analysis of what worked and what didn't. When someone tried a new defensive technique or tool design, the entire community would evaluate its effectiveness and decide whether to adopt, modify, or abandon the innovation. Children participated in this innovation process from an early age, encouraged to ask questions about existing practices and suggest possible improvements. Their fresh perspectives often led to insights that adults, locked into established patterns of thinking, might miss. A child might notice that certain animal behaviors preceded attacks, leading to improved early warning systems, or suggest modifications to existing tools that made them more effective. The testing of new innovations was carefully managed to minimize risk while gathering reliable information about effectiveness. New techniques might be tried first in relatively safe situations, then gradually tested under more challenging conditions as confidence in their value grew. Failed experiments were analyzed as thoroughly as successful ones, with lessons learned becoming part of the community's accumulated wisdom. The most successful innovations were quickly shared with other groups through the networks of communication and cooperation that connected early human communities across vast geographic regions. A defensive technique developed in one area might spread across entire continents as groups shared information during seasonal gatherings or chance encounters. This innovation culture created an accelerating cycle of improvement that gave early humans increasingly sophisticated tools for protecting their children. Each generation built on the knowledge of their predecessors, refining existing techniques and developing new solutions to emerging challenges. The documentation of these innovations in oral traditions ensured that successful developments weren't lost, even if the groups that created them didn't survive. Stories of brilliant defensive innovations, successful protective techniques, and effective child-rearing strategies became part of the shared cultural heritage that all groups could draw upon. The competitive advantages gained through superior child protection strategies had profound effects on early human evolution and cultural development. Groups that were more successful at raising children to adulthood had more offspring surviving to reproductive age, passing on both their genes and their cultural knowledge to future generations. The selection pressures created by this dynamic were intense and multifaceted. Physical traits that enhanced child protection became more common in the human population. Psychological characteristics that supported cooperative child rearing were favored by natural selection. Cultural innovations that improved survival rates spread rapidly through early human populations. But the most important evolutionary pressure was cognitive. Groups that could think more clearly about dangers, plan more effectively for future threats, and coordinate more successfully during crises had tremendous advantages in keeping their children alive. This created strong selection pressure for enhanced intelligence, particularly the kinds of intelligence that supported social cooperation and long-term planning. The children who grew up in the most successful protective environments didn't just survive, they thrived. They developed into adults who were better equipped to face challenges, more skilled at cooperation, and more innovative in developing solutions to problems. These advantages were passed on to their own children, creating an accelerating cycle of improvement. The cultural evolution that accompanied this biological evolution was equally important. Successful child protection strategies became embedded in traditions, stories, and social structures that persisted across generations. Groups developed increasingly sophisticated cultures that were specifically optimized for raising healthy, capable children in dangerous environments. The long-term effects of these evolutionary pressures can still be seen in modern human behavior. Our instinctive responses to threats, our capacity for cooperation in emergencies, our emotional bonds with children, and our drive to protect the vulnerable all trace back to the selection pressures faced by our earliest ancestors as they struggled to keep their offspring alive in an impossibly dangerous world. The legacy of their success isn't just biological or cultural, it's moral. They established patterns of behavior and systems of values that prioritized the welfare of children over individual advantage, community survival over personal comfort, and long-term thinking over short-term gains. These values became deeply embedded in human nature, shaping how we think about responsibility, sacrifice, and the meaning of life itself. When we look at the fossilized remains of early human settlements, we find something that reveals the true genius of our ancestors' protective strategies. Hidden beneath layers of ancient sediment are the remnants of what archaeologists call nursery zones, specialized areas within camps that were designed specifically for the safety and development of the youngest children. These weren't random play areas or simple sleeping spots. They were carefully engineered micro-environments that provided maximum protection, while allowing children to develop the skills they would need as adults. The positioning of these zones within the larger camp structure shows sophisticated understanding of defensive principles that wouldn't be out of place in a modern military handbook. The nursery zones were typically located in the most defensible part of the camp, surrounded by multiple layers of protection. The immediate perimeter consisted of dense thorn bush barriers that were painful for predators to penetrate, but could be quickly cleared by adults if evacuation became necessary. Beyond this, a a second ring of obstacles created additional delay for any threat that managed to breach the first barrier. But the most ingenious aspect of these nursery zones was their dual-purpose design. During peaceful times, they served as safe spaces where children could play, learn, and develop without constant fear of immediate danger. During crises, they transformed into fortress-like refuges where the youngest and most vulnerable could be protected while adults fought off threats. The archaeological evidence shows that these zones contained specialized equipment designed specifically for child protection. Miniature shelters that could accommodate several children while being too small for large predators to enter. Emergency supply caches positioned where children could access them independently if adults were killed or injured. Even primitive communication systems that allowed children to signal for help without leaving their protected area. The children who grew up in these nursery zones weren't passive recipients of protection. They were active participants in their own defense, trained from infancy to understand and respond to the complex systems designed to keep them alive. By the age of 3 or 4, they could identify different types of danger signals, move quickly to designated safe positions, and even assist in basic defensive preparations. This early training created children who were simultaneously protected and self-reliant. They understood that their safety depended on following established protocols, but they also knew what to do if those protocols failed. A 4-year-old child in an early human group might know how to hide silently for hours, how to find emergency food supplies, and how to signal distress without alerting predators to their location. The educational systems that developably sophisticated .D around these nursery zones were remarked children learned through carefully structured play that built real survival skills while maintaining the joy and curiosity essential for healthy development. Games that looked like simple entertainment were actually complex training exercises that taught everything from predator recognition to emergency evacuation procedures. Consider a typical day in one of these ancient nursery zones. As dawn broke and the camp began to stir, children would participate in morning exercises that looked like playful activities, but were actually strength and agility training. They would race through obstacle courses that mimicked the terrain they might need to navigate during an emergency escape. They would play hiding games that taught them to remain motionless and silent for extended periods. The toys found in these archaeological sites tell fascinating stories about early human approaches to child development. Carved wooden animals weren't just playthings, but educational tools that taught children to recognize different species and understand their behaviors. Miniature weapons allowed children to practice the coordination and techniques they would need as adults, without the danger of handling full-sized implements. But perhaps most remarkable were the social toys. Objects designed to teach children about cooperation and group dynamics. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human children played complex games that required coordination between multiple participants, teaching them the teamwork skills that would be essential for survival in their dangerous world. The storytelling traditions that flourished in these nursery zones served multiple educational purposes while providing the emotional comfort children needed to develop properly. Stories weren't just entertainment, but carefully, despite constant exposure to danger. They crafted educational tools that embedded crucial survival information in memorable narratives. A typical story might follow a young hero who faced various challenges and dangers, with each adventure teaching specific lessons about survival strategies. Children learned about seasonal changes, animal migration patterns, food identification, and defensive techniques through tales that were engaging enough to hold their attention, but structured enough to convey accurate information. The storytellers who specialized in these educational narratives were highly respected members of early human communities. They had to master not just the art of engaging presentation, but the science of accurate information transmission. Advertently teach children dangerous storyteller who got details wrong could iron a misinformation that might cost lives in real emergencies. The stories also served crucial psychological functions, helping children process the traumatic experiences that were inevitable in their dangerous world. When a child witnessed violence or experienced loss, Specialized stories would help them understand what had happened and how to cope with their emotions without becoming paralyzed by fear. These therapeutic stories didn't minimize dangers or pretend that their world was safer than it actually was. Instead, they helped children develop the emotional resilience needed to function effectively despite constant threat. They taught that fear was natural and appropriate, but that courage meant acting correctly despite being afraid. The musical traditions that accompanied these stories were equally important for child development and protection. Early humans discovered that children could memorize complex information more easily when it was set to music, leading to the development of survival songs that encoded everything from seasonal calendars to emergency procedures. These songs served practical functions during dangerous situations. Coordinated singing could help maintain group cohesion during long, frightening marches through hostile territory. Specific musical signals could communicate complex information quickly and quietly. Even the rhythm of work songs could help coordinate group activities that required precise timing. Children learned these musical traditions from infancy, absorbing the melodies and rhythms before they could understand the words. As they grew, they gradually learned the meanings embedded in the songs, building a comprehensive knowledge base that was both practical and culturally meaningful. The seasonal ceremonies that marked important transitions in children's lives were elaborate productions that served multiple functions in early human society. They celebrated individual achievements while reinforcing community bonds and transmitted crucial cultural knowledge to the next generation. These ceremonies weren't just symbolic rituals, but practical assessments of children's readiness for increased responsibility and independence. A child undergoing a coming-of-age ceremony might be required to demonstrate mastery of essential survival skills, knowledge of group traditions, and ability to contribute meaningfully to community protection efforts. The preparation for these ceremonies was intensive and comprehensive, involving not just the individual child, but their entire extended family and social network. Everyone had a role to play in ensuring the child was properly prepared for their new responsibilities and privileges. The ceremonies themselves were designed to be memorable and meaningful, creating powerful emotional experiences that would stay with children throughout their lives. But they also served as public demonstrations of the community's commitment to its youngest members, reinforcing the social bonds that made effective child protection possible. The dietary strategies developed for children in these early human communities were remarkably sophisticated, based on detailed understanding of nutritional needs and food safety that rivaled modern knowledge in many respects. Adults learned to identify which foods provided the specific nutrients growing children needed and how to process potentially dangerous items to make them safe for consumption. The food preparation techniques used for children were often different from those used for adults, reflecting understanding that young digestive systems had different capabilities and vulnerabilities. Certain foods were ground into easily digestible pastes, while others were fermented or cooked in ways that increased their nutritional value or reduced potential toxins. The timing of meals for children was carefully managed to ensure steady energy levels and optimal growth. Early humans understood that children needed to eat more frequently than adults and required different balances of nutrients at different stages of development. They developed feeding schedules that maintained children's health while accommodating the unpredictable demands of survival in a dangerous environment. Special provisions were made for children during times of food scarcity. Adults would voluntarily reduce their own consumption to ensure children received adequate nutrition, understanding that the survival of the next generation was more important than individual comfort in the short term. The food storage and preservation techniques used by early human groups were specifically designed to ensure that nutritious options remained available for children, even during extended periods when fresh food couldn't be obtained safely. They developed methods for preserving fruits, vegetables, and proteins that maintained their nutritional value while extending their shelf life. The medical knowledge applied to child healthcare was extensive and sophisticated, encompassing everything from preventive care to emergency treatment of serious injuries and illnesses. Early human healers developed specialized techniques for treating children that accounted for their smaller size, faster metabolism, and different responses to various treatments. The diagnostic skills possessed by these ancient healers were remarkable. They could identify nutritional deficiencies, developmental problems, and the early stages of various diseases through careful observation of children's behavior, appearance, and physical condition. This early detection allowed for interventions that often prevented minor problems from becoming life-threatening conditions. The treatment techniques used for children were adapted to account for their psychological as well as physical needs. Healers understood that children who were frightened or traumatized by medical procedures might become reluctant to seek help in the future, potentially hiding injuries or illnesses that required treatment. The pharmaceutical knowledge possessed by early human groups included detailed understanding of which medicinal plants were safe for children and how to modify dosages based on age, size, and condition. They developed child-specific preparations that were more palatable and easier to administer than the treatments used for adults. The surgical procedures performed by early human healers included techniques for treating childhood injuries that were remarkably advanced for their time. Archaeological evidence shows successful treatment of complex fractures, head injuries, and other trauma that would challenge even modern medical professionals. The rehabilitation techniques used to help children recover from serious injuries or illnesses were comprehensive programs that addressed not just physical healing, but psychological recovery and social reintegration. Children who had been weakened by illness or disability received specialized training to help them contribute meaningfully to group survival, despite their limitations. The community support systems that surrounded medical care for children were extensive networks that mobilized entire groups around the needs of individual patients. When a child was seriously ill or injured, everyone adjusted their activities to provide the care, protection, and resources needed for recovery. The preventive healthcare practices used by early human groups were sophisticated systems designed to maintain children's health and prevent the development of serious problems. These included regular health monitoring, environmental management to reduce disease transmission, and lifestyle practices that promoted strong immune systems and physical development. The dental care provided to children was surprisingly advanced, including techniques for cleaning teeth, treating infections, and even primitive orthodontic interventions for developmental problems. Early humans understood the connection between oral health and overall well-being, developing practices that kept children's teeth and gums healthy despite their challenging environment. The vision and hearing care provided to children included methods for identifying and compensating for sensory impairments that might otherwise compromise their ability to detect and respond to dangers. Children with visual or auditory limitations receive specialized training that helped them develop alternative ways of gathering information about their environment. The psychological healthcare provided to children was a comprehensive system of emotional support, trauma treatment, and mental health maintenance that helped young people cope with the constant stress of living in extreme danger. This wasn't formal therapy as we might recognize it today, but it was systematic and effective intervention that prevented many children from developing debilitating anxiety, depression, or other mental health problems. The crisis intervention techniques used when children experienced severe trauma were immediate and comprehensive responses designed to prevent lasting psychological damage. When children witnessed violence, experienced loss, or survived near-death experiences, the entire community would mobilize to provide comfort, explanation, and ongoing support. The resilience training provided to all children was systematic preparation for the psychological challenges they would face throughout their lives. Children learned coping strategies, stress management techniques, and emotional regulation skills that helped them function effectively despite constant exposure to danger and uncertainty. The social integration practices used by early human groups ensured that children felt valued and connected to their communities despite the harsh realities of their world. Every child had multiple adults who cared about their well-being and development, creating networks of support that could survive the loss of individual caregivers. The leadership development programs that prepared children for future responsibilities were comprehensive educational systems that identified and nurtured the qualities needed for effective group leadership. Children who showed aptitude for coordination, decision-making, or innovation received specialized training that prepared them to guide their communities through future challenges. As these ancient children grew and developed within their protective communities, they weren't just surviving, but thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible given the dangers surrounding them. They were learning skills, developing relationships, and building the foundation for future achievements that would ultimately transform human civilization itself. The legacy of these early human child protection strategies extends far beyond simple survival techniques. They created the foundation for human society as we know it, establishing patterns of cooperation, innovation, and care that continue to shape our world today. Every time we protect a vulnerable child, every time we work together to solve a difficult problem, every time we sacrifice individual advantage for community benefit, we're following patterns established by our earliest ancestors as they fought to keep their children alive in an impossibly dangerous world. Their story reminds us that human civilization isn't built on individual achievement or technological advancement alone. It's built on the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when those they love are threatened, on the power of communities united by shared purpose, and on the endless creativity of human beings who refuse to accept that any challenge is impossible to overcome. The genius of early human child protection wasn't just about surviving one crisis or defeating one predator. It was about creating sustainable systems that could adapt and evolve as new challenges emerged. As environmental conditions changed, as predators developed new hunting strategies, as human groups grew larger and more complex, their protective methods had to change too. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa shows us how these adaptations played out over thousands of years. In regions where saber-toothed cats became extinct, human groups quickly modified their defensive strategies to address the new predator species that moved into vacant ecological niches. When climate shifts altered migration patterns of prey animals, human communities adjusted their seasonal movements and hunting techniques accordingly. But the most remarkable adaptations were social and cultural. As human groups grew larger, the simple protective strategies that worked for bands of 20 or 30 individuals had to be scaled up for communities of hundreds. This required new forms of organization, new communication systems, and new ways of coordinating defensive activities across much larger populations. The development of specialized roles within these larger communities was a breakthrough that multiplied their protective capabilities exponentially. Instead of every adult being responsible for every aspect of child protection, individuals began specializing in specific areas where their natural talents could be most effectively utilized. Some individuals became master scouts, developing extraordinary abilities to detect approaching threats from vast distances. They could read subtle changes in animal behavior that warned of predator movements, interpret weather patterns that preceded dangerous storms, and identify the nearly invisible signs left by hostile human groups passing through their territory. Others specialized in defensive engineering, becoming expert at modifying natural features to create protective advantages. These ancient engineers could assess terrain with the eye of a military tactician, identifying choke points where small numbers of defenders could hold off much larger attacking forces, elevated positions that provided commanding views of surrounding areas, and natural features that could be enhanced to create impregnable refuges. The weapons specialists who emerged in these communities weren't just skilled fighters, but innovative technologists who continuously improved the tools available for protecting children. They experimented with different materials, tested various designs, and developed manufacturing techniques that produced increasingly effective defensive implements. But perhaps the most important specialists were the child development experts, individuals who dedicated their lives to understanding how young humans could be most effectively prepared for survival in their dangerous world. These ancient child psychologists developed sophisticated insights into learning, motivation, and emotional development that guided their community's educational practices. They understood that children learned differently at various ages and stages of development, requiring different teaching methods and different types of challenges. They recognized that some children were naturally cautious, while others were impulsively brave, and they developed individualized training programs that worked with each child's natural temperament rather than against it. These specialists also understood the importance of play in child development, but they transformed play from simple entertainment into sophisticated educational experiences. The games children played weren't random activities, but carefully designed learning experiences that built specific skills, while maintaining the joy and spontaneity essential for healthy psychological development. A game that looked like simple tag was actually training in evasion techniques that might save a child's life during a predator attack. What appeared to be innocent wrestling matches were actually instruction in basic combat skills and physical conditioning. Even seemingly peaceful activities like storytelling and singing were structured learning experiences that built memory, communication skills, and cultural knowledge. The assessment systems developed by these early child development specialists were remarkably sophisticated. They could evaluate not just what children knew, but how they thought, how they processed information under stress, and how they interacted with others during challenging situations. These assessments weren't academic exercises, but practical evaluations of readiness for increased responsibility and independence. Children who demonstrated mastery of essential survival skills, good judgment under pressure, and the ability to work effectively with others were gradually given more freedom and more important roles in community protection activities. Those who weren't ready received additional training and support until they could meet the required standards. The graduation ceremonies that marked these transitions were elaborate celebrations that served multiple functions within early human communities. They honored individual achievement while reinforcing community bonds and values. They provided opportunities for sharing knowledge and techniques between different groups. Most importantly, they created powerful emotional experiences that motivated children to continue developing their capabilities. But these ceremonies weren't just celebrations. They were also practical demonstrations of community preparedness, opportunities for different groups to showcase their innovations and learn from each other's successes. A ceremony might include competitive demonstrations of defensive techniques, displays of new technologies, and presentations of successful strategies for dealing with specific threats. The knowledge sharing that occurred during these gatherings was crucial for the continued evolution and improvement of child protection methods. Innovations developed by one group could spread rapidly through entire regions as communities shared their discoveries and learned from each other's experiences. The trading networks that connected early human communities weren't just economic systems, but information highways that carried news about threats, techniques, and technologies across vast distances. A defensive innovation developed in one valley might reach communities hundreds of miles away within a few months, spreading through the network of relationships that connected early human groups. These networks also served as early warning systems that could alert distant communities to approaching dangers. When one group encountered a new type of predator or discovered that familiar threats had developed new hunting strategies, word would spread through the network, allowing other communities to prepare for challenges they hadn't yet faced directly. The complexity of these communication networks was extraordinary. Messages had to be accurate enough to convey crucial survival information, but simple enough to be transmitted reliably through multiple intermediaries. Early humans developed standardized ways of describing threats, locations, and techniques that ensured important information wouldn't be lost or distorted as it passed from group to group. The seasonal gatherings where multiple communities came together were massive coordinated events that required sophisticated planning and organization. Hundreds or even thousands of individuals from dozens of different groups would converge at predetermined locations for celebrations, trade, knowledge sharing, and social activities that strengthened the bonds between communities. These gatherings were also opportunities for young adults from different groups to form relationships and create new family units, ensuring genetic diversity and strengthening the connections between communities. The courtship rituals that developed around these events weren't just social customs, but strategic alliances that created networks of mutual support and cooperation. But the most important function of these seasonal gatherings was the coordination of regional defense strategies. Representatives from different communities would share information about threats they had encountered, discuss successful defensive techniques, and coordinate their activities to provide mutual support during particularly dangerous periods. The regional coordination that emerged from these gatherings was remarkably sophisticated. Communities would agree to share scouts and early warning information, coordinate their seasonal movements to avoid conflicts over resources, and provide mutual aid during emergencies that overwhelmed individual groups' defensive capabilities. When a particularly dangerous predator appeared in a region, multiple communities might coordinate their efforts to drive it away or eliminate the threat entirely. When environmental disasters struck one area, neighboring groups would provide shelter, food, and other assistance to help displaced families survive until they could re-establish themselves. The diplomatic protocols that governed these interactions were complex systems of customs, obligations, and mutual agreements that ensured cooperation while managing the inevitable conflicts that arose between different groups. Early humans developed sophisticated methods for resolving disputes, negotiating agreements, and maintaining peaceful relationships, even when resources were scarce and tensions were high. As you turn off this video tonight and slip into the safety of your modern world, remember that every breath you take is a victory earned by ancestors who refuse to let impossible odds define their limits. Their story isn't just ancient history gathering dust in some forgotten corner of time. It's the beating heart of everything that makes us human. The next time you see a parent instinctively reach out to steady a child on uneven ground, you're witnessing a million years of evolutionary wisdom in action. That protective reflex, that fierce determination to shield the vulnerable, that willingness to sacrifice everything for the next generation, it all traces back to those first humans who looked into the darkness of a predator-filled world and said, "No, not today, not our children, we are their legacy," walking proof that love really can conquer the unconquerable.